Chapter 2. On their journey home, the Quarcoopomes had been chatting for more than an hour about such dry subjects as the organization of parish clubs and the forthcoming change in the leadership of the Women's Fellowship, in an attempt to avoid the touchy topic of Mary. Finally, Mrs. Quarcoopome found the courage to hit the nail on the head. Her husband began to feel nervous and his limbs started to go numb. "Are you saying that we should tell Mary the truth?" he asked his wife. "No, not at this time when she is taking her exams for entry to university. It is the most crucial time in her life," she replied firmly. "But the truth will come out sooner or later, and you know it," he said. "Yes, I do, but of what use is the truth to her now? Weigh the relevance of the truth now against the consequences of telling it. I am of the opinion that the truth is like an old song, it has the same effect anytime it is sung. All the same, I pity Mary." Father Quarcoopome coughed. "You don't understand me, Zandria. I am not talking about her real parentage. She will be deeply hurt if she learns that we are not her blood parents, but I am talking about Mary's present dilemma, these convulsive attacks which, I believe, have their inexplicable source in forbidden areas." He glanced at his wife. "Don't dabble in matters that God will not permit you to understand." "My dear, I believe in dabbling in the truth. Mary should have been told everything a good 10 years ago. If we had done that, God would have pardoned us, and we would not have lived in constant dread of okra mouths spilling the beans to Mary at any time. Now, believe you me, the devil is doing that himself." It was characteristic of Father Quarcoopome to put all blame on the unseen devil. "Be careful. Look out. You are getting angry and going out of your lane. Mind your driving. Oh. He swerved the car wildly from the path of the oncoming 15-ton petrol tanker, missed it by a hair's breadth and headed for a huge odum tree. Zigzagging and out of control, the car finally hit a smaller tree stump with a sharp jolt and eventually came to a standstill. Father Quarcoopome stared at his wife. "Zandria," he called as he shook her, feeling an icy panic creeping through his body. "Zandria, answer me." There was no answer. He held her wrist and found her body still warm, though he could not feel her pulse. He stretched her body across the front seat and hurriedly made for the roadside and help. The angry tanker driver and his mate moved menacingly towards him, undeterred by his priestly gown. "Please help me. I think my wife is dead in the car." Their angry looks mellowed into instant sympathy, and together they walked towards the wrecked car. The driver felt Mrs. Quarcoopome's temple. "She is cold," he announced. Between them they pulled her out of the car, carried her over to the tanker and settled her between the mate and her husband in the cab. Unable to make a U-turn on the narrow old Winneba road, they raced for 2 long miles to the nearest roundabout, before heading for Men's Scrum Hospital, 2 miles in the opposite direction from the scene of the accident. At the hospital, events took place with a clockwork precision. Whilst the priest narrated the incident, 2 nurses went through a fast first aid ritual, and the patient was soon wheeled away. Many minutes passed and the visibly troubled priest began to pace across the reception hall. He stared at one wall painting after another but saw nothing. Eventually, as he became aware that he was looking at paintings, he realized that what he was staring at was a picture of Saint Peter the Rock, and underneath it was the inscription, "Faith." Gradually the tension left him. Behind him a door opened noiselessly, and a youthful doctor called to him, smiling. "Lucky you, sir. Your wife's all right." "Glory be to God," he replied thankfully. "Would you come in, please?" Father Quarcoopome followed the young doctor. Zandria's face was bathed in soft, controlled smiles. She offered her husband her left hand. He took it, squeezed it gently and asked, "How are you, my dear?" But she just nodded and continued to smile. "I'll leave you for a few moments," said the doctor, and he walked out. They were chatting softly when the doctor returned to discharge Mrs. Quarcoopome. After the bill was settled, the good doctor offered to drive them home as they would be going his way. As they were driven along, the Quarcoopomes learned that the doctor was a specialist psychiatrist, a bachelor, and had intentions of going to the University of Vienna to study psychiatric medicine further. By the time they all had reached Father Quarcoopome's humble home, Dr. Charles Nonase Sego had learnt what could be described as the brief outline of the Quarcoopomes' family history. He heard how they had an only child, whom her mother had unmindfully called a stepdaughter. At the girls' high school, she was an upper sixth former and a prefect who was extremely beautiful. Why Mrs. Quarcoopome had added the last piece of information baffled the doctor slightly. He concluded that it must be her way of stressing that Mary was her own daughter, and that the reference to a stepdaughter had merely been the mild effect of a shock. Her mind was now gathering her scattered memory together, he thought. The doctor was informed about what Father Quarcoopome called the light which had changed his entire life, and how Mrs. Quarcoopome had come to marry an unassuming priest. Finally, feeling him to be a genuinely sympathetic person and also knowledgeable in the field, Mary's parents confided in the doctor about the troubles their daughter was undergoing at present, describing how at times she appeared to be taken over by a strange frenzy, and the things that followed as a result. As he left their modest home for his plush bungalow, the doctor had two things to muse about: Mary the beautiful girl, and also, why her mother had been so keen to advertise her. It was while he sat watching a rather dull program on television that he realized how involved he was already becoming with the Quarcoopomes. His mind had switched off from the television and onto the enormous problem of how to heal Mary from what he guessed might be a personality split. "Mary, please find out who is at the door," her father shouted from upstairs. Dr. Sego was struck almost dumb by Mary's beauty. He realized then that her mother's advertisement had been poor in comparison with the girl now standing in front of him. There she was, in a dress that was just tight enough to do justice to her sensual curves, which Charles now traced appreciatively with his eyes. "Good afternoon," he managed to stammer out. "Good afternoon," she replied confidently. "I suppose you must be Dr. Charles Sego. You look much younger than I expected. Come in, please." "Thank you, and you must be Mary, am I right?" "Yes, that's right." "Are your parents in?" "Yes, and they're expecting you for lunch." "Oh good," Charles said, still not fully composed. "When did your school vacate?" "Oh, term hasn't finished yet, but I have come home to study for my final exams, so I have said au revoir to Girls High for a while. I will return to sit the exams and to hand over my baton to the next prefect at the end of term." She opened the front door wider and gestured to him to step in. "Oh, welcome Charles, welcome. We have been looking forward to this lunch for the past week." "How are you?" inquired Mrs. Quarcoopome with great enthusiasm. "Fine, thank you. I have also been looking forward to it." "Where is father?" "Upstairs. He will be here in a moment. Do have a seat." As Charles settled on the sofa, Mary offered him a drink. Her father entered as she brought the beer Charles had requested, and his face brightened with a delighted smile when he saw the doctor. He clasped Charles' hand in both his own and shook it heartily as though they were old schoolmates. "How are you, my son? First let me thank you for your near-divine help last week. We shall never forget it or you. May God bless you." "Thank you, Father, and how are you?" "Oh, pretty much in shape, thank you." "Have you met Mary?" "Oh Mary, come and meet Dr. Sego." They shook hands, smiling warmly, and each sat at one end of the sofa. The Quarcoopomes sat opposite, leading the conversation as they all sipped their appetizers. They all enjoyed the light talk so much that they did not realize how the time was flying until the clock struck 2 and Mrs. Quarcoopome invited them to the table. The first course of fufu and shellfish soup went well, though slowly and in silence, the only sound coming from the cutlery on the bowls. Then Mrs. Quarcoopome broke the awkward silence. "Are you enjoying the soup, Charles?" "Oh yes, very much thank you." Mary prepared as she said, emphasizing her daughter's name. Mary smiled broadly, but her father's forehead creased in faint anger at his wife's unnecessary promotion of his daughter. Just then Charles' eyes met Mary's and they held each other in a long gaze. Charles could see sorrow, fear, and mental struggle in Mary's face. He could not understand the sudden change in her expression. Her fingers began to shake visibly, and then she clenched her teeth as if with malice. Next, her eyes began to roll like those of a wounded cat determined to gain vengeance, and she stared ahead, looking like a witch in divination. Instinctively, the others started and pushed their chairs backwards in fear of the horrible spectacle. A yellow substance began to foam out of her mouth. Recollecting himself, Charles rushed to Mary's side, and she viciously spat the fluid into his face. She got up, armed herself with her knife and fork, and with total ease lifted her end of the heavy oak dining table, watching gleefully as everything on it slid sideways onto the floor. She started upstairs, climbing the steps in leaps and bounds as Charles followed her in blind pursuit. Mary's parents sat spellbound, shocked by the horrible sight. They could hear Charles pounding on the bedroom door in order to gain access to satisfy himself as to the true nature of Mary's agony. "Mary, please open the door," Charles pleaded when he had found his voice and recovered from the shock of the sudden force of Mary's hatred towards him. Father and Mrs. Quarcoopome now joined Charles' pleas with two mournful voices. "Get away while I sup with the devil," shouted Mary. Then all around became silent, as if the silence itself was a power that held their mouths. Inside the room, Mary looked around frantically. There was nothing to lay her hands on for destruction. Her desperation mounted with the passing seconds, and with the knife she slashed her left shoulder. The blood began to flow instantly, and her mouth worked eagerly on the wound, sucking it like a lion satisfying its hunger on long chase after prey. Suddenly the blood ceased to flow, but this was not the time for blood shortages. 3 insane slashes went into her left eye. They were not serious wounds, but were cut with a surgical precision to let the blood flow profusely. The smell of blood was all that Mary needed. She began to feel hot and tore her new cotton dress in two effortlessly with one stroke. She removed it and attacked it with new viciousness. In seconds the dress was in shreds. With the onslaught of these attacks, it was impossible to imagine Mary's newfound strength. At last, she caught sight of herself in the dressing table mirror. Rushing at it, she crashed her right fist sideways into it, smashing the glass into smithereens. "Mary," her mother called, "open the door." "Get away," she replied. "I am in concert with the devil himself." "Oh, she shames us though," her mother said through her sobs. "Forgive me, but that is not the point," Charles said respectfully. "The important thing is to find the root cause of these well-timed attacks. This is not shameful in any way, Mary is simply not herself at these times. Besides, this is not the time to argue. Let's try to help the poor girl." "Mary," Charles called, "can you hear me?" She began to sob. Charles glanced at his watch. It was 2:23 p.m. He realized from the sound of Mary's remorseful weeping that the horrible attack was over, and that, for the time being, the danger had passed. "Let's leave Mary for a while. She'll come to herself now," he whispered to the confused couple. "All will be well soon. I believe that we would be embarrassing her if we went in now, for she has recollected herself, and I feel she would be ashamed to be seen in that ghastly situation." Taking the initiative, he led them to the dining room where the food and broken plates stared up at them from the floor. The two houseboys who were called to clear up winked at each other. The seconds slid by. Charles broke the ghastly silence. In such cases, immediately after an attack, the victim is aware of the abnormal situation he or she is in and is very shy and sorry. Shy of the gazing eyes around and sorry for him or herself. Despite his sad tone, the doctor's voice was reassuring in its authority to Mary's parents. "Oh, I see, I understand," Mrs. Quarcoopome cut in. Charles continued, warming to his topic. What medical science is unsure of is whether such attacks are caused internally or externally. By internal, we mean a normal bodily disorder. By external, we mean something to do with a disorder which cannot be determined, or sometimes even cured, by normal diagnosis. Here is an illustration. A patient goes to his doctor with a high temperature, loss of appetite, restlessness, and a splitting headache. Any average doctor would diagnose fever. That much is simple. Then another patient goes to him with a throbbing pain in his head. It may easily be described as migraine, but when the pain moves the next day into the roof of his mouth, then to the back of his neck, and the next day turns into a lump in the jugular vein and moves slowly into the back of his left eye, then it is not so easy to diagnose the problem. He stopped to look closely at his small audience, and finding them to be fully attentive, he resumed. However superficially we may look at it, once the symptoms are clear we can proceed with a systematic approach to a cure. You will no doubt agree with me that Mary is really the only one who can tell us authoritatively what is wrong with her. That is, she is the only one who can describe exactly what she goes through when these attacks come on. From the little we know, she has had no fewer than 5 weekly attacks of a similar nature and at precisely the same time, and that is what is so strange. Why do these attacks come only on Sunday afternoons at 2:20 p.m.? It could be that they have their root in schizophrenia, which is a splitting of the personality, although I do not really think so. You see, as a result of this condition, the patient's intelligence remains functionally normal, but his emotions distort aggressively. It does not mean that the patient has more than one personality as many people believe. Certainly, we cannot say that Mary's 2:20 p.m. Sunday attacks are paranoid schizophrenia. She does not at present appear to believe that other people are persecuting her. Mary is. The doctor raised his eyes to the wooden staircase which now sounded with Mary's carrot footsteps as she returned to the normal ward. He got up and walked towards her. They met on a small landing and Mary rushed into his arms, clinging to him for the comfort and reassurance she so badly needed after the ordeal of her attack. "Hello Mary, I am so glad you are fine now." Yes, I am." Holding hands, they descended the remaining flight of stairs and joined her parents. "Mary," her mother said calmly, "you will be all right. God is with you. Yes, you are under the shadow of the Almighty and no harm shall come nigh unto you," her father added. But inwardly Father Quarcoopome knew that such biblical statements needed the true faith of a believer if they were to achieve anything. The contours of Mary's face revealed to Charles another period of unnecessary embarrassment for her. He glanced at his wristwatch and then looked sharply at Mary's parents. "I think Mary needs some air and relaxation. If you don't mind, I'll take her for a drive." "Oh no, not at all," Father Quarcoopome replied, so with his permission they all got up and Charles led Mary to his car. The car moved at a leisurely pace as if the occupants were honeymooners, but truly each was lost in their own thoughts. Charles swerved the huge car into the car park of the Club Loretta without conscious thought. In silence the pair walked hand in hand to the large kiosk nearby where they bought some cashew nuts and popcorn. The place, as was usual for Sunday afternoons, was jammed with teenagers all dressed in the latest fashion of bleached and patched denim jeans. Mary looked at her beautiful green skirt and blouse, then down to her leaf green sandals and then back up to Charles' light green safari suit. She realized that they did not belong and began to pull Charles away. Charles chuckled and they walked back to the car. Softly Charles eased the car onto the road and 30 seconds later swerved onto the dual-carriage ring road, heading towards the Independence Circle. There he made a right turn and headed for Kotoka International Airport. As they neared the Cocoa Marketing Board flats, Mary made a request to see a friend there. Standing on the forecourt, she called out animatedly to Shoma, whose family lived on the first floor. Mary knew that Shoma had come home from school for a weekend break, and sure enough she soon showed up on the balcony. "Hi Mary. I'll be down there in a split second," she called and showed up even sooner. "Good afternoon," she greeted Charles. "Good afternoon," he responded. "Shoma, meet Dr. Charles Nana Sego, a family friend." "Charles, this is Shoma Akwe, my closest friend on earth and a form mate at Girls High." That's nice to hear," said Charles as they shook hands. Shoma whispered something into Mary's ear, they both giggled and Mary slapped Shoma's arm in mock anger. The girls began to chat avidly, and Charles walked off to the lawn tennis courts nearby where two adults were playing as seriously as if the stakes were as high as at Wimbledon. 10 minutes later Mary joined him, and they drove away. "Sorry I kept you waiting there," said Mary. "I do hope you don't think I was rude." "No, of course you weren't. Indeed, I was really enjoying the tennis game. Now, what about a change in the program? How would you like me to take you to the doctor's clubhouse?" "Fine, I'd love it." They circled the airport car park and headed back to Independence Roundabout. Turning right onto the dual carriageway, they passed the modest National Broadcasting House, always the first place to be seized during a coup by the military. The car slid on and arrived at the country's most popular roundabout with its glorious fountain and assortment of neon lights. The roundabout's name was changed with every historical event, from Kwame Nkrumah Circle in 1966 to National Liberation Circle in 1967, to National Redemption Circle in 1972 and then back to Kwame Nkrumah Circle. As was usual on a Sunday afternoon, the streets were almost empty of cars but were teeming with people from all walks of life. Hawkers were selling everything from Benz car spare parts to dirty iced water, and a good proportion of the crowd was made up of rival syndicated pickpockets, who would strip you naked if you dared to close your eyes for 1 minute. At the Obetsebi-Lamptey roundabout, Charles turned left, zoomed the car along the ever-quiet Mortuary Road and was soon parking in the doctor's car park. When they finally arrived at the doctor's clubhouse, the place was in a party mood. There were bearded professors in their 50s and 60s, young surgeons in their 30s who usually came alone to try their luck in courting their superiors' daughters, and female doctors of all ages who came with love looks for any unaccompanied males. All eyes turned towards them as they entered. Mary felt embarrassed, but Charles ignored them and, taking Mary by the hand, made straight for a corner table. A waiter came to take their order for drinks, and they plunged into conversation like old friends. "Are you comfortable?" "Yes, document. Call me Charles." "Are you sure you don't want anything more?" "Yes, I am sure." "Now let's have a little quiz. What is the full meaning of the word tips?" From her expression of mild surprise, it was obvious that she did not know the answer. "Let's make a toast first," she suggested. "I might find the answer at the bottom of my glass." "Cheers." Charles raised his glass. "Cheers." She followed suit and downed the contents of the small glass. "Have you found out?" "No," she admitted. "It means to instill prompt service." "Sounds like greasing their palms, eh?" "Meaning?" "A decent name for a bribe." She laughed at the joke and, for the first time, seemed fully recovered from her recent ordeal. That was what Charles had been hoping for. "Charles, isn't it my turn to quiz the learned doctor who saved my mother?" She laughingly teased. "It is," he replied gravely. "Good, now, who is the king in a schoolboy's bag?" "The pen," Charles answered without thinking. "No, the ruler. A ruler is obviously a king." He smiled broadly, appreciating the joke, then he led the conversation once more. "Now, tell me, Mary, why do you want to read medicine? I know it is your personal choice, but what prompted you to choose that profession from among so many others?" "Well, it is mostly just a feeling, but also partly the result of a reaction to my father and his ideas. When I was about to choose my subjects for O-level, my father insisted that I should read the liberal arts. He is a man who talks of saints, often quotes Immanuel Kant, Rousseau and Bacon, and is always talking about the nature of truth. To him the whole universe poses one big question. During whiskey time with his few friends since he has been made bishop, he continually bores them with the same topic, the magic of Jesus, which he calls mysticism, or studies of the path to the light. Some of the brave ones sleep during this time. I am also bored by looking at life in this way. I found an answer to the question of life in nursing, and I intend to make a career out of that." About 2 years ago, Mary told Charles, thoroughly warming to her subject now, "I fell sick and had to go to the Cape Coast General Hospital for treatment. But oh my! For the first time I saw a woman doctor. I felt a tinge of jealousy because I had often fantasized about being the first woman who would be able to treat herself at home when she fell sick. From then on, I made up my mind that I would be the second woman doctor at Cape Coast General Hospital. That's nice to hear. Do you have any brothers or sisters? No, I don't have any. How come? I don't know the reason any more than you, Mary shrugged. Perhaps my parents had more than enough with me, she suggested playfully. Meanwhile, a popular disc was spinning, and Charles asked Mary for a dance. She really charmed him with her graceful movements, and very often Charles missed his step because he was concentrating on Mary rather than on the beat. They returned to their seats and Charles could see that she was fully relaxed now. This was the time to attempt to discover more about her attacks. Mary, he whispered softly, tell me honestly about your attacks, for you are the only one on earth who really knows all that you feel on Sunday afternoons. Don't exaggerate or understate. Mary's face clouded and she turned troubled eyes towards him. You see, I don't know except that suddenly it comes on. No, Mary, you do know it. Everybody knows at least to some extent what is wrong with them. Try to tell me, please. At least you can remember how it comes on. Take your time and cast your mind back to all your experiences. You will realize that certain things always happen each time. For instance, you always vomit, don't you? Yes, I do. You tear your dress, don't you? Yes. And then you slash one of your shoulders. Yes. But before you do these things, what is the beginning like? How do you feel? You see, as it approaches, at about 2:15 on Sundays, a mild anticipatory tension, some unexplained excitement seizes hold of me. Initially it is a mild sensation, and I can overcome it. It acts almost as a prelude and builds up until just a short time before 2:20 p.m. when I am so tensed up, I could explode. That is when I am no longer mistress of myself. At that fateful point in time, Charles, all that I can think of is that I am somebody's servant, ready to carry out that person's whims and fancies. I lose my will to resist, and strangely enough I am blinded by sheer fury. I am sure that I am possessed at these times because I instantly acquire a great deal of energy, too much strength for my liking. Then I have a funny feeling in my stomach, and from there, well, you know the story. But Charles, there is one strange thing I can't tell anybody but you. At those times, like the vampire, I have a strong appetite for fresh blood. Is that why you always slash yourself? She answered with a nod and felt instant relief. Moving closer, she whispered into his ear, and then suddenly I can do all the fetish dances of Accra. We can all do strange things some of the time, Charles tried to reassure her. Mary smiled. Do I sound funny? No. Is there anything you want to add? That's all I can remember. Mary answered, shaking her head. Just one more question. After you have drunk the blood, how do you feel then? Oh. So free, so emancipated. From what? From the devil himself, she whispered. Charles showed no outward emotion, but within his thoughts were in a turmoil. He felt inadequate and deeply sorry that he could not diagnose the problem and propose a cure. Despondently, he wondered whether this disease might not be beyond the realm of psychiatric help. He considered what might happen if his inability to cure her became evident to Mary and concluded that that might spell her doom. The sound of Mary's glass being returned to the table brought Charles back from his reveries to the present, and for the first time he lied to her. Mary, yours is not the first case of its kind, it is simply that it does not occur frequently. But I can tell you that we will move heaven and earth for you. Be assured. Mary's relief was obvious as she smiled at Charles. Thank you, Charles. From then on, they went several times onto the dance floor before Charles reluctantly suggested that they should go home. He drove Mary back to her parents' house, bid them all goodbye and promised to be as frequent a visitor to their household as Mrs. Andrea Quarcoopome had requested. Don't fail to see Mary often, she said playfully, and her husband frowned. As Charles drove home, he considered the mess in which he was becoming so inextricably involved. Briefly his thoughts flitted to Ioka, his fiancée, who was at Queen Mary's Teaching Hospital in Kent. By July she would be out of school as a fully qualified mental health nurse with a diploma in pharmacology. Long ago they had planned to marry in the first December after her examinations and then to carry out together important research into infants' mental diseases, and possibly to write a book on the subject. Now it looked as if that plan had to be shelved for the time being, possibly even forgotten altogether. He began to doubt the statements made by the sages of old that we are masters of our fate. As he went through the front door of his bungalow, he heard the telephone shrilling and hurried towards it. "Hello, Charles Sego here. This is Mary. I was checking to see if you'd got home in one piece. Can I tell Ma and Pa that you are taking me to the pictures tonight? That is if you have nothing else on." "Can I?" she asked him breathlessly. "Yes, please do," he said, pleased. "Oh, thank you." After she had rung off, he slowly replaced the receiver, musing deeply once more about Mary's case. Decisively he lifted the receiver again and called the Carbo Teaching Hospital to discover the schedule of his closest friend, a colleague and fellow student of psychiatry. Each had complemented the other professionally in times past, and now each was brilliant and considered the other a challenge, even at times as a barrier to supremacy, though their friendship had never waned. The matron told Charles that Dr. Omakaya Metifio had finished working barely an hour ago. He phoned Dr. Akamai's parents as he knew his friend usually visited them after work and learned that he had dropped in briefly but had then gone straight home. Determined to contact his friend, Charles phoned his home number. The telephone rang for 5 unbearable minutes before a gruff voice responded. To his disappointment, it was Akamai's houseboy with the news that his master had been home, packed his bags and gone off to Akasambo. As to when he would return, the houseboy had no idea. Rudely Charles banged the telephone down on its cradle, then dropped onto the sofa. He closed his eyes despairingly, hoping to have a nap, and opened them after what seemed ages to find that only 2 slow minutes had passed. Thoughts of Mary came into his mind again. Her parents had said that she was reserved, but Mary had turned out to be as open as a book, and her approach to all things was adult, sometimes even forward. Her questions could pull the rug from under your feet, and she would laugh at your consternation. Her advanced maturity could be explained, he decided. No brothers to turn her into a tomboy and no sisters to confide in. She had had to grow up fast and to learn things for herself. With a mother who was always buried in the Bible, who never sat with her daughter, who never asked her daughter's opinions about politics, religion, a teenager's thoughts, a mother who always drugged her daughter in moral codes, no wonder she appeared to be 1,000,000 miles away from her daughter's true feelings and character. His mind wandered away to Mary's father, a kindly and sympathetic man, but always wrapped up in his own work and the Bible. Poor girl, thought Charles, no wonder there is a wide sea that separates her from them. He opened his eyes again, only 2 more minutes had elapsed during his musing. He tried to doze again but found Mary in his thoughts still. She was in girl's high uniform, smart on a Monday morning, fat books in her arms, walking to her classroom. Then he found her after her last lectures on Friday, leisurely strolling to her room, then found her helplessly torn in agony on a Sunday afternoon. He could see her with a jackknife striking at an unseen tormentor. The tormentor had now entered into her shoulder and she slashed it with increased fury. He could see her sucking out the devil. Then there was a foaming yellow vomit that entered her dress. The poor girl attacked her dress, her newfound strength pitted against the devil. Eventually she won the battle and collapsed in a pool of tears. Finally, he could see her looking around for human consolation, but there was none. She was truly alone then and utterly miserable, yearning for comfort. Charles opened his eyes, but he could not see the time for his own tears had blinded him. He could not believe he had been crying. He put a handkerchief to his eyes and a sudden panic gripped him. Here he was, holding desperately on to a life that was slowly and helplessly slipping into a yawning grave. It was clear to him now that his medical knowledge alone could not help him. He stood up and went to the telephone. He lifted the receiver to his face and then his fingers began to shake. 3 times he dialed Carbu Teaching Hospital, 3 times he was connected to a private phone. Finally, he got the number he wanted. Could you put me through to Professor Eastman's residence, please? I mean the dean of the medical school. Yes, thank you. Eastman here, can I help you? Afternoon, sir, this is Charles Sego here. Oh, how nice. How are you, my dear boy? Fine, sir, thank you. Sir, I have rather a difficult problem and I think I may need your help. When can I come over to see you? If it's itching you that badly, I am free now. Come on over. Thanks, sir. I will be there as soon as possible. When he had replaced the receiver, Charles reviewed the conversation and wondered if he had sounded too panicky. Charles had passed the dean's house by 2 whole blocks before he realized the mistake. Reversing quickly, he stopped 1 house away and began to adjust his thoughts into cohesion. To start with, he mused, I have not yet examined my patient to find out whether this is a mental or a bodily case. If it turns out to be bodily, then I have totally misfired. I am positive this is a mental disorder, but even there my information is sketchy and unexamined. I have no knowledge of the family's medical history, or the patient's personal character traits or habits. In fact, I have hardly known my patient for a day. The seconds passed as Charles marveled at his rashness. However, I am heavily involved in this case already and all I can do is to make the best of a bad situation, he concluded, and he thoughtfully made his way to the dean's front door. The dean's huge wife ushered him in. Welcome, Charles, said the dean between puffs of smoke from his oak and gold-plated pipe. Thank you, sir. Have a seat. You have never sounded so desperate, it's not like you. What is it? Charles had that feeling he'd had during his student days in tutorials. It has something to do with a patient of mine, he explained. By the way, what will you have? Nothing, sir, thank you. Nothing. Have something, boy. A beer would help to relax you at least. All right, I will, thank you. As I was saying, it's about a patient of mine. Well, she is not officially a patient at the hospital, but I wish to have her admitted there. I am well aware of the shortage of facilities and the rule laid down by the medical authorities that no more mental patients should be admitted for the time being, but Professor, this is a case with a difference. It could make or break me. He stopped suddenly, realizing that he was becoming emotional. Pausing briefly, with the hawk-like eyes of the professor upon him, he collected himself, swallowed, took a deep breath and resumed in a more even tone, I wish to apply to use the girl as a case study. As a solo effort, not a group case study. Now wait a minute. Didn't you say that she is not yet a patient at the hospital? Interjected the dean. I did, sir. Is the patient your relation? Not really, sir. It is just that I'm a family friend. What is her name? She is called Mary Quarcoopome. Wait a minute, that rings a bell. Oh, but the only Quarcoopome I know of is the New Trinity. Bishop of Accra. He and his wife came with their daughter to a state function quite recently. That is the very girl, sir. My God. Whatever is the matter with her? I seem to remember that during the cocktails she was a lively little thing. Very pretty, chatty and happy. What's the trouble then? Charles told him of Mary's strange attacks. You mean only on Sundays? I mean just that, and afterwards she is once again Mary Quarcoopome, the pretty, laughing girl you met. The dean pressed the bell button and a houseboy materialized almost immediately through the side door. Get me some whiskey, please, he ordered. 2 long and silent minutes passed before Professor Eastman heard the chinking of ice on glass which brought him from his deep musings to awareness of the young doctor waiting anxiously before him for an opinion. He smiled kindly at Charles. You see, Charles, from the scanty data you have submitted, we may prematurely classify our patient as schizophrenic. Charles' hopes lifted at the word "our." She is emotionally aggressive, with intent to destroy by way of self-defense, right? Yes, sir, that's what I believe. Does she return to childhood fantasies or behavior during the attacks? No, sir. Is she briefly, or for longer periods, unable to care for herself? Only very briefly, during the 3-minute attack. Does she seldom or frequently hallucinate? Not during the attack, though I am not sure if that is a permanent trait of hers or not. After the attack, does she have any difficulty in adjusting to reality? You know, there are patients who take weeks to recognize husbands, wives, mothers, who cannot remember the taste of favorite foods, and so on. No, she adjusts easily, in seconds. Is she secretly on any illegal drugs? No. How do you know? The dean's eyes pierced through Charles, but he didn't falter. Instinct. I just believe she wouldn't, and anyway I've seen no signs to suggest that she might be. Have you taken any blood samples from your special patient? No. Charles sighed. He had not missed the reference to Mary as his own patient, and is alone. He felt anger tear inside him. He wanted to tell the dean that the girl was quite normal at home, that he had just danced with her and was very fond of her, and that, right then, right at that very moment, he had a date with her. Do you believe there is something, or somebody, persecuting her? If he said yes, then he was introducing superstition at a very early stage. The code of ethics did not allow such nonsense, he knew, but he stuck his neck out. I have a strong temptation to believe that. He looked at the dean, steadily meeting his hard gaze. Then I am afraid, Charles, you have misfired. The hospital cannot help her if what you believe is really so. In agony, Charles bit deeply into his lower lip. The dean stared at him unwaveringly. Don't rush yourself, Charles. Help me to help you. Where have you placed her? I mean, in what category? I think, paranoid. Does she imagine that people talk about her? Only during the attack. Do you think she suspects any of her family to be the cause of her handicap? No, and she is the only child. Who does she think wants to harm her? She has virtually no idea. Does she believe that she is normal? She considers herself to be absolutely normal apart from the attacks. Charles, think carefully. As her doctor, do you consider her to be biclinical, or what sociologists and psychologists call contemporary community standards, normal? Charles felt a hollow pain in the pit of his stomach. If he said no, then there was no need to have bothered the learned dean. He should have done his homework better. Psychiatrists don't run helter-skelter because of one mad girl, he reflected cynically. The world has enough mad girls to forsake one. If he said yes, then he was equally mad and needed a psychiatrist himself. For here he was falling in love with a stark raving lunatic. Well, Professor, he said with an unconcealed plea in his voice, this is a temporary disability that allows no room for conclusions at present. Damn psychiatry again, he mused. It was like writing the obituary notice for a man still alive. The professor was lost in thought once more. Charles glanced at his watch. It had been a long session. It was 6:30 p.m. If the interview continued much longer, he would be late for his date. However, he reflected, getting Mary completely well was his prime concern. He sat, waiting respectfully for the dean to break the silence. Presently the professor lifted his head, smiled at Charles, and glanced at his glass of whiskey. It was untouched. This was quite characteristic of him in moments of deep thought. Thank you, Charles. I find this case most interesting. I admire your gallantry, but go slow. When I am ready to meet your patient, I shall inform you, but should you find a reason to call on me before then, don't hesitate to do so. I am always able to find time for you. Charles thanked him, then hesitated. Here was the best opportunity on earth for him and Mary. I was wondering if you could find time next Sunday to lunch with us and to acquaint yourself with the patient and her problems at first hand. Well, I shall see my secretary tomorrow for my program for the week, and she in turn will communicate to you the possibility of such an engagement. In the meantime, look after your patient well. She appears to need support. Right, sir, thank you. Charles got up and the professor saw him to the door. As Charles drove home, he felt light-hearted and happier than he had done for a long time. Mary might prove to be his stepping stone to higher laurels in psychiatric medicine, as well as being the sort of girl he'd always dreamt of but never hoped to meet. He began to whistle a romantic song, popular at the moment. It was called, "Who Is She and What Is She to You?"